On a polished May afternoon, the steel-blue skies above Bastion Point Military Institute cast sharp shadows across the stone plaza, where families in tailored suits and summer dresses spilled into the ceremonial rotunda. Inside, the space echoed with traditions, flags of valor hung in formation, brass names etched on plaques. But among the confident young graduates in ceremonial whites, a solitary figure entered with little notice. An old man, tall yet weathered, with a cane in one hand and a worn army green beret slouched low over his brow. His uniform jacket bore muted insignia, sun-faded yet intact, and in his other hand he held a crumpled letter, its edges soft from repeated unfolding. He moved slowly, eyes scanning, breath shallow, as if searching for something only he could recognize. Yet before he could reach the central aisle, two academy marshals in dress blues exchanged quick glances and intercepted him. "Can I help you, sir?" one asked, tone firm but impersonal. "This section is for guests with credential bands only." The man held up the letter wordlessly. "Please step aside," the second marshal added, his hand brushing the veteran's elbow. And so began the quiet unraveling of an injustice, public, precise, and painfully familiar. The old man stepped back, not out of fear, but out of practiced discipline. Behind him, brass bugles blared the opening anthem, and rows of parents stood with pride. But he didn't look at the stage. His eyes stayed locked on a single figure, a tall young cadet in white, his posture perfect, his expression solemn. As the anthem ended, the crowd clapped. The veteran didn't. He simply whispered a name beneath his breath, Daniel, and clutched the worn letter tighter. His name was Colonel Abe Mathers, though the full weight of that title had been laid aside long ago. Born in Helena, Montana, the son of a cattle rancher and a school librarian, Abe never dreamed of becoming a soldier until the day his older brother died in a training accident during officer candidate school. He'd been 17 then, skinny, quiet, awkward around girls, and the loss had carved a sense of duty into his bones so deep it never left. He enlisted that fall. By 19, he was deployed. By 25, he was fluent in 2 dialects of Pashto and fluent in something harder, how to survive when you're outnumbered, outgunned, and still expected to bring your people home. Over the years, Abe became a master of the unseen. Not the glory-driven missions captured in recruitment ads, but the kind they never told civilians about, midnight supply drops into rebel-held territories, long-haul escorts across mined valleys, the sudden thrum of rotor blades in the dark as medics loaded stretchers under fire. He operated in jungles and deserts, snowfields and slums. His file was filled with commendations that came with no press releases. He never made general. He never wanted to. "The higher you went," he said, "the more you lost sight of the boots on the ground." He commanded the 3rd Battalion of the 5th Special Forces Group during its most active years. Operation Sand Bridge, Desert Paradox, and most famously, Operation Tigris, an unofficial name given to an unsanctioned humanitarian intervention where Abe, disobeying a direct stand-down order, coordinated the evacuation of over 200 civilians from a collapsing village hospital after a friendly fire incident had triggered chaos. He sustained 2 gunshot wounds and a spinal injury from the concussive wave of an RPG strike. He refused extraction until every child and medic had been airlifted. For that, he was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. Quietly. By then, his body was beginning to betray him. His right leg dragged slightly. His hearing in his left ear was mostly gone. But what truly haunted him were the losses, the men who didn't return, the letters he wrote to families, the moments when a wrong call cost someone else their life. That weight doesn't show up on ribbons. After his final deployment, Abe returned home to a half-empty house. His wife, Carla, had passed from a sudden aneurysm while he was stationed overseas. She died in her sleep, alone. The news had come through a static-filled satellite call 3 days too late for the funeral. Their son, Daniel, was 16 at the time, living with relatives in Fort Hood and feeling every inch of distance a war can put between people, even those who share blood. Abe flew in, stood silently at Carla's grave, and tried to speak. He couldn't. Daniel resented him for years. For the silence, the absences, the unreachable stare that seemed to follow every deployment. Abe didn't defend himself. He just remained present when allowed, sending letters, voice recordings, the occasional book with underlined passages. Slowly, things began to shift. Not through apologies, but through the language they both understood, commitment. When Daniel expressed interest in the ROTC program, Abe offered only a nod and a worn field manual. "If you're gonna lead," he said, "do it from the front." He never pushed. Never bragged. And when Daniel got his acceptance to Bastion Point, the most prestigious military academy in the state, Abe didn't cry, though his hands trembled as he folded the letter. That same letter, now creased and nearly translucent at the edges, was the one he carried today. His body was slower now. The cane was not for show. But the discipline remained sharp. He had prepared for weeks for this one day, pressed his old uniform, visited the VA barber for the first time in years, even practiced the route from the parking lot to the rotunda on Google Earth. No email had come confirming a formal invitation, but Daniel had said the seats up front would be reserved for family. That was all Abe needed to hear. He arrived 2 hours early to make sure he wouldn't be in the way. He hadn't expected the guards. He hadn't expected to be questioned. But in truth, Abe wasn't surprised either. Veterans like him were often forgotten. They became statistics or talking points, rarely people. His neighbors in the small Montana town barely knew he'd served. He never hung flags or wore pins. The green beret he wore today hadn't left its storage box in a decade. But this day wasn't about him, it was about Daniel. As he stood outside the rotunda, brushing invisible lint from his jacket, he could hear the brass instruments warming up. Families filed past him, their credential bands flashing in the sun. No one looked twice. A boy asked his mother if he could take a picture with the statue of General Hoyle. Abe smiled softly. Somewhere inside, Daniel would be in formation, practicing the pledge. He imagined his son's face, not the boy he'd left behind, but the man he'd become. Then the ceremony began, and Abe stepped forward. What happened next, the dismissal, the interruption, the cold professionalism of protocol, was not unfamiliar. He had lived in systems his whole life. He understood the chain of command. But when the envelope slipped from his hand and the photos spilled out onto the polished floor, when no one stooped to help, when even the guards remained unmoved, a different kind of ache stirred. It was the ache of invisibility. The ache of being erased in the very house he'd helped build. Abe reached down slowly, steadying himself against his cane. The photo, Daniel at age 12, standing proudly beside his father in uniform, lay face up. On its back, in Daniel's handwriting, "To my father, my compass." He picked it up. The guards didn't notice. They were already turning him toward the exit. As the academy marshals led Colonel Abram Mathers toward the rotunda entrance, their touch was civil but decisive, arms firm on either side, eyes forward. They didn't manhandle him, but they didn't pause to ask more than once who he was. They had rules. Lists. Procedures. To them, he was just an elderly man without a credential badge. "I'm here for my son," Abe said evenly. "Understood, sir," one replied. "But protocol is clear, only verified guests inside the main hall. You can watch from the overflow room," the other added, gesturing to a screen-lined alcove down the hall. "I'm not here to watch a screen," Abe murmured, almost to himself. But he didn't fight them. He followed. That was the soldier in him. Orders, even when misapplied, still echoed with discipline. Inside, the rotunda ceremony pressed forward. Names were called, ranks conferred. Families clapped, cameras clicked. Somewhere near the front, Daniel stood in formation, probably scanning the crowd. Perhaps confused. perhaps thinking his father had chosen not to come at all. That thought burned deeper than Abe would admit. Behind them, the envelope he'd dropped fluttered across the polished floor. No one noticed. No one bent to retrieve it. It finally settled beneath a bench as more guests passed by, smiling and talking, blind to the fading green beret, the limp, the worn uniform. They reached the vestibule where double doors muted the noise inside. A screen nearby showed the ceremony's live feed. Abe stood watching silently as a cadet was pinned, her parents rising to hug her in tears. The applause was hollow through the speakers. "Can I sit?" he asked. "Just here," one of the marshals said, nodding toward a bench outside the main doors. Abe lowered himself carefully. His hip ached, and the scar tissue in his lower back throbbed from standing too long. He breathed in slow, shallow pulls, watching figures blur past. He unfolded the program, parchment paper, elegantly printed. Daniel's name stood near the top, marked with a gold emblem, Saber of Integrity Award. The highest honor. Abe blinked twice, then smiled faintly. He hadn't known. Daniel must have kept it secret, perhaps saving it as a surprise. But Abe wasn't on the guest list. There were no names under Family of Honorees. Just Daniel. Alone. Across the entryway, a woman carrying a baby carrier paused and glanced toward him. Her eyes briefly flicked over the cane, the beret, the medals. She smiled, small and polite, then looked away. Abe leaned forward and reached slowly for the envelope now partially exposed beneath the bench leg. His hand trembled slightly. As he retrieved it, the photograph slipped out again, Daniel as a boy, beaming beside Abe in full dress uniform. On the back, the note remained, "To my father, my compass." He stared at it for a moment, then tucked it away. That's when he heard his name. Not spoken loudly. But clear. Deliberate. Mathers. He looked up. Across the lobby, near the ceremony entrance, a woman in dress uniform was watching him. Captain, by the rank bars. Her name tag read, Rahim. Her eyes didn't carry pity, they carried precision. She began walking toward him with purpose. Her medals were modest, but her bearing sharp. She didn't slow as the marshals stepped into her path. "Ma'am, this area is for..." "I know exactly what this area is," she said coolly. "Stand down." They hesitated. Her tone wasn't confrontational, it simply didn't allow room for disagreement. They stepped back. She stopped before Abe and offered a hand. "Colonel Abram Mathers?" He studied her. "Yes. I'm Captain Aliyah Rahim." "Sir, would you come with me?" He didn't rise at first. He searched her face for motive. But there was only respect in her gaze. "Do you know who I am?" "I know what you've done." That was enough. He rose slowly, steadied by her hand. She didn't lead him toward the exit. She turned him toward the center doors. The marshals watched but said nothing. As they passed the threshold, light from the rotunda bathed them. The crowd hadn't noticed yet, music was playing, a group of cadets lining up near the stage. But a few heads began to turn. Captain Rahim guided Abe down the center aisle. They passed the reserved family rows. One officer near the dais narrowed his eyes, leaning forward. They reached the front. Rahim turned, faced the stage, and lifted her voice. "Permission to address the dais," she called. Gasps scattered through the rotunda. The dean, seated beside a cluster of decorated officers, stood halfway, confused. "State your request." "I request recognition for a senior officer omitted from today's program." She turned slightly toward Abe. "Colonel Abram Mathers. 5th Special Forces Group. Distinguished Service Cross. Bronze Star with Valor. Commander of Operation Tigris. And father of Cadet Daniel Mathers." The hall froze. A full second passed. Then whispers. Then stilled motion. An officer in the second row rose to his feet. Then another. A ripple moved outward, chairs shifting, backs straightening. One by one, men and women in uniform stood. Abe looked down the line. Young faces. Old ones. Some had tears. The dean stepped forward. "Colonel Mathers," he said, voice measured. "Please accept our deepest apology and our gratitude." Abe nodded once. But he said nothing. He didn't have to. He was finally being seen. Captain Aliyah Rahim stood beside Colonel Mathers as the rotunda held its breath. The old soldier remained quiet, still gripping the envelope in one hand, cane planted like an anchor in the other. The standing officers hadn't sat back down. Their posture spoke volumes, even without words. It wasn't just respect, it was correction. A silent rebuke of the oversight. The dean glanced to the master of ceremonies, then to the band director. With a nod, the brass quieted. For a moment, no announcements were made. No names were called. No cadets moved. The rotunda simply breathed together in unity, awaiting what would come next. Rahim turned her head slightly toward Abe and asked, "Would you like to sit up front?" Abe's voice was low. "I would like to see my son." "That," she said gently, "can be arranged." She led him not to a seat in the audience, but along the side of the stage where a small section of chairs was marked, command staff and presenters. There were 3 empty chairs in the back row. Without hesitation, she cleared the first and motioned for him to sit. He did so slowly, lowering himself with both hands on the cane. From this vantage point, Abe could finally see his son clearly. Daniel stood tall in the front cadet row, jaw set, eyes forward, unaware of the change in the room. His hands were folded behind his back, spine ramrod straight in the tradition of officers who came before. The sunlight from the stained glass dome shimmered against the brass buttons of his coat. Abe smiled, faintly. There was so much of Carla in the boy's face. The ceremony resumed. Cadet after cadet was called forward. Pledges were recited. Oaths were sworn. Pins and commissions administered. And then, finally, Cadet Daniel Mathers, the announcer said. The name rang out like a chord, crisp and unbroken. Daniel stepped forward. His eyes scanned the audience, and for the first time, he noticed the shift, the standing officers, the dean's unsettled glance toward the edge of the dais, the murmuring of the audience. Then he saw him. His father. Seated, upright, still and strong despite the years. Daniel's step faltered, just slightly. But he recovered. The announcer continued. Cadet Mathers has earned the Sabre of Integrity Award, representing the highest standard of leadership, service, and moral courage. In his final report to faculty, Cadet Mathers wrote, "Character is not born from praise. It is learned from silence, example, and consistency." The audience applauded, but Daniel raised a hand before approaching the dais. "With respect," he said, turning to the dean, "may I request a deviation from standard protocol?" The dean, surprised, nodded. "State it." "I request that my commissioning oath be administered by the man who taught me what service means. My father." Gasps rippled through the rotunda. The dean glanced toward Colonel Mathers, then back to Daniel. Permission granted. Abe did not rise immediately. Captain Rahim moved to offer help, but he waved her off gently. He stood, slowly, with the deliberate strength of someone who has endured far worse than time. As he walked to the podium, the silence grew deeper. He looked at his son. Daniel looked back. The distance between them had once felt insurmountable. Missed birthdays. Funeral silence. Letters written but never mailed. Yet at this moment, none of it mattered. They were two soldiers, bound by something more permanent than regret. Abe raised his right hand. Daniel mirrored him. "Repeat after me," Abe said. His voice was raspy, but firm. "I, Daniel Mathers. I, Daniel Mathers. Do solemnly swear. Do solemnly swear. That I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States. That I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States." The oath continued, line by line. With each word, the rotunda seemed to draw tighter in reverence. Phones remained pocketed. No one dared move. "So help me God. So help me God." Abe lowered his hand. Daniel snapped to attention and saluted. Abe returned it, not as a father, but as a fellow officer. There were no cheers. Only silence. Then, slowly, a wave of applause began. Not thunderous. Not stadium-like. But steady, rising with authenticity. It moved like a tide from the back to the front, pulling even the most stoic generals to their feet. Abe stepped down. Daniel remained on the stage a moment longer, eyes still following his father. When he finally returned to his seat, the cadet beside him whispered, "That was your dad?" Daniel nodded. "He's the reason I'm standing at all." Backstage, Abe took his place once again in the chair near Rahim. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. But when she looked at him, there was more than respect in her gaze now. There was gratitude. "He saved us," one of the instructors whispered from nearby. "During Tigris. I was medevac. I've never seen anyone hold a perimeter like that under fire." Abe didn't respond. He simply adjusted his cane and turned his gaze back toward the ceremony. For the remainder of the commissioning, no one asked him to leave. No one questioned his place. He had already proven he belonged. Near the close of the event, the dean returned to the podium. "Today we witnessed more than ceremony," he said. "We were reminded of a truth that too often slips through our fingers, that leadership is not about appearance, rank, or seating charts. It's about integrity. About those who carry the weight so others may stand. Today, we thank not just those receiving commission, but those whose quiet legacy made their rise possible." He paused, then nodded toward Abe. "To Colonel Abram Mathers, and others like him, we see you." The crowd stood again. This time, Abe stood with them. As the final notes of the recessional hymn echoed through the marble dome of the rotunda, Colonel Abe Mathers remained standing, not out of formality, but as a man reclaiming ground. The band lowered their instruments, and rows of newly minted officers turned to face the audience, their expressions still carved from the emotion of the last hour. At the back of the room, parents and siblings surged forward to meet their graduates, laughter and tears blending with the ceremonial hum of closure. Yet at the front, an unspoken circle had formed around Abe. Captain Rahim hadn't moved from his side. Nor had the dean. General Linhart, the most senior officer in attendance and a former theater commander during Operation Stormveil, approached slowly, his chest gleaming with ribbons from 2 generations of campaigns. "Colonel Mathers," he said, extending a hand, "I've heard your name more times in field briefings than I can count. I regret that today is the first time I've had the chance to thank you." Abe took the hand with a steady grip. "I wasn't looking for thanks," he replied. "No," Linhart said with a small smile. "But you were owed them anyway." Word spread fast. By the time Daniel reached the front, escorted by 2 of his cadet peers, the crowd had thinned near the chairs but gathered in clusters along the sides, all watching as father and son stood facing each other. Daniel removed his white cadet cap and extended it to Abe. It's tradition for the first officer to whom a cadet reports to place this back on his head. I'd like that to be you. Abe hesitated, his fingers brushing the brim. You sure? I've never been more certain. With practiced care, Abe lifted the cap, adjusted its alignment, and placed it onto his son's head. You wear it well, he said. A second wave of applause rolled through the crowd, this time not directed by ceremony, but rising naturally from the hearts of those present. Even parents who didn't know the story applauded, guided by the gravity of the moment. The dean, moved by what had unfolded, stepped back to the microphone. "There are moments," he began, "when a tradition is honored not by following it, but by correcting it. Today, Bastion Point nearly made a mistake we would have regretted for decades. Thankfully, some names speak louder than credentials." He looked directly at Abe. "This institution stands on foundations shaped by those who served before these cadets ever dreamed of doing so. From this day forward, we will make space in every commissioning for the recognition of such service, not as a formality, but as part of our living doctrine. Colonel Mathers, you've given this place more than we can repay." Someone called, "Speech." A brief, awkward chuckle spread. But Abe shook his head. "I've said all I needed," he replied. "The rest's in his hands now." Still, Rahim leaned over and whispered, "You sure? Even a few words?" He turned to her. "I've spent a lifetime giving orders. Today, I'm content to witness." But the dean wasn't done. "Colonel Mathers," he said, "if I may ask, would you be willing to visit our history department before the summer term? We'd like your first-hand account of Tigris and your work with field intelligence. Not as a war story, but as leadership training." Abe smiled faintly. "I'd need to dust off the memories." "They'll dust off just fine," Rahim said. "Some of us learned from the stories already." She turned, her voice lowering as she added, "You didn't know, but your field tactics were required study in trauma response. I memorized every detail of the Tigris evac." Abe raised a brow. "They taught that?" Rahim nodded. "The leadership under duress module." He chuckled. "I was never much for modules." Daniel stepped forward. "He wasn't. But he taught me something better." The three of them stood quietly for a moment, soldier, medic, son. Behind them, the ceremonial staff began to clear chairs. Lights dimmed. The sound of leather folders closing and flags being lowered created a soft background rhythm. Abe turned to Daniel. "Got plans after this?" "A small dinner," Daniel said. "Just a few cadets and instructors." "You're invited, of course. Still got that Tex-Mex place down on Lexington?" Daniel blinked, then laughed. "You remembered that? It's where we stopped before your first JROTC drill meet. You had 3 burritos and a stomachache for the ages." "I remember. You laughed so hard, I thought you'd break your ribs." The conversation eased them both. The edges of the ceremony began to soften, replaced by the rhythms of reunion. Then a voice called from behind, "Colonel Mathers?" A woman in civilian clothes approached, carrying a notebook and a press badge. "Anna Holt, Bastion Ledger." "I don't want to interrupt, but would you be willing to share a few words for our piece on today's commissioning? What happened here, people will be talking about it." Abe frowned slightly. "I didn't do anything special." "I think you did," she said, glancing at Daniel. "And so does half the hall." He gave a tired nod. "You can quote me on this, I didn't come here for recognition. I came to see my son. I'm just grateful someone was paying attention." Anna jotted the line down carefully. "That'll go in word for word." Rahim leaned in again as Anna walked away. "They'll probably want a full interview." "I've spent most of my life doing things people couldn't publish," Abe said. "I'll need to learn how to talk in headlines." "You just did," she said, smiling. As the hall continued to empty, Daniel motioned toward the exit. "Ready?" Abe stood. Slowly. His joints complained, but not as much as they used to. And when Daniel instinctively reached to assist, Abe let him. They walked together toward the grand archway, past rows of polished columns and banners from past graduating classes. As they neared the sunlight, Daniel stopped. "Dad." Abe turned. "I know I didn't say it enough growing up. But I saw what you did. Even when I didn't understand it. I know what you gave up." Abe placed a hand on his shoulder. "No one joins to be understood. We serve so others don't have to." Daniel nodded, eyes stinging. "Still, I'm glad you came. I never wasn't going to." They stepped into the sun. And the doors behind them closed not in dismissal, but in tribute. The late afternoon sun cast long gold shadows across the cobbled courtyard outside Bastion Point Military Institute. The flags lining the perimeter flapped gently in the breeze, each bearing a different division, a different war, a different chapter in the country's military history. But today, all eyes were on a living legacy walking among them. Colonel Abram Mathers didn't walk quickly. He didn't need to. Daniel matched his pace beside him, jacket slung over his shoulder now, no longer the rigid cadet but a young officer stepping into something deeper than uniformity, identity. A few of Daniel's classmates came over, one by one. They shook Abe's hand, introduced themselves with respectful nods and the kind of curiosity only cadets turned officers carried, eager to absorb wisdom but wary of overstepping. Abe met each handshake with equal parts humility and steel. "Sir," one said, "we studied Operation Tigris in our third-year strategy module." "I'm surprised it made the curriculum," Abe replied. "It's taught as a model of tactical improvisation under impossible odds." Abe grinned faintly. "That's a formal way of saying we were making it up as we went." Laughter softened the air. Another officer, barely out of his teens, asked, "How'd you hold the convoy perimeter that long with no reinforcements?" Abe tapped his temple gently. "Discipline and sandbags. Mostly discipline." Rahim stood a few paces back, observing. She wasn't interjecting or correcting. Just watching, an instructor processing a moment where history became flesh. Then, breaking her stillness, she stepped forward and said, "Colonel, I meant what I said earlier. You're a part of our doctrine. Even those who never met you carry your lessons." Abe looked her in the eye. "It's not about the man. It's about the pattern. The habit of standing firm when everything else folds. Teach that, and names don't matter." "They matter today," she replied. A sudden voice called from behind, younger and sharp, "Colonel Mathers." A young woman in formal ROTC attire approached. She was not a cadet of Bastion Point, her patch bore the emblem of a different school. She held out a thick folder. "I printed everything I could find on your career. From the archives, citations, field briefings, your Afghanistan deployments especially." Abe raised an eyebrow. "You read all that?" She nodded. "Your story kept me going through my rehab rotations. I memorized your medevac report from Kunduz. Word for word." Abe blinked slowly. The silence that followed wasn't dismissal, it was stunned respect. He took the folder and leafed through the first few pages. His old reports. His field notes. Names he hadn't spoken aloud in decades. Some of those names were now engraved on walls. "I thought all this got lost in a filing cabinet," he said quietly. The cadet shook her head. "Some of us went looking." Daniel turned to Rahim. "Is this normal?" Rahim chuckled. "It is now." Abe sat on the stone ledge of a fountain near the courtyard center. He set his cane aside for a moment and let his hand dip into the cool water, lost in thought. Around him, clusters of guests slowly dispersed, but a steady stream of people still made their way toward him, not with fanfare, but with intention. One by one. A former logistics captain who'd served with Abe in Mosul. An instructor who'd studied Abe's counterinsurgency technique in West Africa. Even a woman in civilian clothes who simply said, "You saved my brother. I was 12 when the telegram came. But he came home." Abe didn't have words for each interaction. Often, he didn't need them. Sometimes a hand on the shoulder, a nod, or a tight-lipped smile did more than conversation. Eventually, the courtyard began to quiet. Daniel sat beside his father. For a while, neither of them spoke. The sunset began casting a red hue across the flagpoles. "You know," Daniel said finally, "I used to resent the army." "I figured," Abe said. "You never said it, but I saw it. I thought it took you from us. From Mom." "It did," Abe admitted. Daniel looked down. "But today I saw what it gave back." Abe's jaw tightened. "It's never a fair trade. But when you choose to carry weight, you don't get to measure it. You just lift." Daniel leaned back, letting the warmth of the stone seep through his uniform. "I'm going to try to do this right. Lead with purpose. Without losing what matters." Abe looked at him sideways. "That's the part they don't teach. Balance. Anyone can follow orders. The real test is deciding which ones should be followed at all." From across the courtyard, Rahim approached once more, this time holding a small ceremonial box wrapped in a velvet cloth. "We almost forgot," she said. "Tradition requires it." She placed it gently on Abe's lap. Inside was a single polished coin, a Bastion Point Legacy Honor Medallion. Normally reserved for instructors, visiting generals, or posthumous dedications. On the back, it read, "For those who carried us here." Abe turned it over in his hands, thumb tracing the edge. "I don't deserve this," he said. "Too late," Rahim replied. "It's yours." He didn't argue. He tucked it into his breast pocket without ceremony. Daniel stood. "You ready to go, Dad?" Abe took his time getting up. His legs were slower than his will, but steadier now. Rahim offered the cane, he accepted it. He looked one last time around the courtyard, the banners, the marble, the cadets taking photos with proud parents. A memory flashed in his mind. Dust, not sunlight. Memories, not dinner reservations. Men in uniform, young and already too old, laughing over burned coffee. Another era. But not gone. He turned back to Daniel. "You drive?" Daniel grinned. "Barely." "Perfect," Abe muttered. "We'll crash by mile 10. As they walked toward the edge of campus, Rahim called out, "Colonel, one last thing." They paused. She held up her phone, screen already recording. "Any words for the next class?" Abe thought for a long moment. Then he stepped forward, stared straight into the lens, and said, "You don't need to be remembered to matter. Just make sure that when it counts, someone knows they weren't alone." The recording stopped. No tagline. No applause. Just truth. Daniel clapped him lightly on the back. "Let's get that dinner." Abe nodded. "Let's." As they exited through the iron gates, the bell at Bastion Point rang once. Not for time. Not for formality. But for memory. Honor remembered.